In a sleepy suburb of Sagewood Hills, Arizona, a retired couple, Lena and Frank Delaney, were enjoying the slow rhythm of their golden years. Their lives were measured in sunrises shared over coffee, evening walks with their two sprightly terriers, Muffin and Scout, and weekend calls from their grown children. But one ordinary morning, their predictable world shifted. Lena, 72, shuffled toward the kitchen with her first mug of chamomile tea, sunlight streaming across the freshly raked gravel yard. Frank, already outside tending his prized desert tomatoes, glanced up when she called. "Frank," her voice carried a rare urgency, "you have to come see this." He joined her at the sliding patio door. What they saw made him blink in disbelief. There, tumbling over the cushions of their weathered patio furniture, were two speckled kittens. They darted, pounced, and somersaulted as if auditioning for a nature documentary. But these weren't strays or someone's missing pets. "They've got ear tufts," Lena whispered, clutching Frank's arm. "I think they're bobcats." Sure enough, behind them, half hidden beneath the sprawling mesquite tree they planted 15 years earlier, sat a regal adult bobcat. Her coat shimmered in shades of earth and ash, her amber eyes steady and watchful. Frank, a retired park ranger, inhaled sharply. "She's magnificent, but this is her territory now." Thus began an unexpected chapter in the Delaney's otherwise predictable lives. The wild had moved in, uninvited but unignorable. The silence that followed their realization was not empty, but full, charged with a mix of awe, curiosity, and the fragile tension of standing on the edge of something ancient and unpredictable. The world outside their patio had always seemed tame, landscaped with precision, boxed in by stucco fences and HOA regulations. But now, the wild was pressing its nose up against the glass. Lena's fingers tightened around her mug. "Do you remember when we saw that lynx up near the Mogollon Rim?" she murmured, not taking her eyes off the kittens. Frank nodded slowly. "Back in '89. Thought it was a ghost at first. There was something ghost-like about the way the kittens moved, fleet-footed, ethereal, untethered to human logic. One batted at a fallen leaf that had drifted onto the cushion. The other pounced and missed, landing in a clumsy sprawl. Their innocence was disarming, as if the boundary between predator and pet hadn't yet been drawn in their minds. The mother remained statuesque beneath the mesquite, her stillness more commanding than movement. She radiated a kind of primal authority, a sovereign queen presiding over her temporary kingdom of flagstone and terracotta pots. For Lena, who had once taught fourth-grade science, it stirred a forgotten part of her. She used to tell her students that Arizona's ecosystems were full of marvels, ringtails, roadrunners, Gila monsters, but it had always been talk. A curriculum, controlled and compartmentalized. This was real, unfiltered. It was something she could feel vibrating behind her ribs. Frank stood beside her, lips pressed in a thin line. He wasn't afraid, but his mind had already clicked into its old training, reading signs, assessing risks. Years ago, in another life, he'd tracked mountain lions through pinyon forests. He knew what it meant for a predator to claim a space. Still, neither of them could look away. "What do we do?" Lena finally asked. "Nothing right now," Frank said. "We watch. We learn." They stood there for minutes, maybe longer, suspended in a quiet so profound it felt sacred. The morning's warmth began to swell across the yard, casting soft golden halos around the kitten's fur. Muffin and Scout, sensing something unusual, had gone silent inside, pressing their wet noses against the bottom of the door. In that moment, Lena felt something she hadn't expected, not fear, but privilege. It was as if the earth had parted briefly to let them witness a secret. Nature had chosen them, not with ceremony, but with trust. The kittens continued their chaotic ballet, their tiny bodies moving with the exuberance of youth and the precision of wild DNA. Every leap, every twist, was a rehearsal for a life that would eventually demand stealth, strategy, and survival. But for now, they were just playing in the morning sun, unaware of how rare this communion was. Frank eventually turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. "We'll have to be careful. They'll be unpredictable." Lena nodded, but her eyes were still on the kittens. And beautiful. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the scene, the way the mother bobcat had watched them, not with hostility, but with evaluation, the same way a parent sizes up a babysitter. She thought of her own children, now scattered across different states, and the ache that lingered even during cheerful phone calls. Is it possible, she wondered, that all mothers, human or wild, shared the same silent language? The next morning, she found herself at the window again, tea in hand before the sun had fully breached the horizon. The yard was empty. The furniture cushions were askew, and faint paw prints trailed across the patio tiles like cryptic hieroglyphs. Frank joined her, yawning. "Think they'll come back?" "They already have," she said, pointing to a small smear of dust disturbed on the cushion. "They just came and went before we woke up." It became a ritual, watching for signs. A bent stem, a scratch in the dirt, fur snagged on a low branch. They became trackers, observers, quiet participants in a secret world unfolding just outside their glass door. And with each day, that invisible boundary between domestic and wild thinned, like fabric worn soft by time. Lena began writing small notes on the fridge, reminders that had nothing to do with errands or grocery lists. Look for tracks after rain. They prefer the east side shade. Mesquite tree equals base camp. Even the dogs began adjusting. Muffin stopped barking when she sensed the bobcats nearby. Scout began growling at shadows less often. It was as if the entire household had recalibrated around this delicate new reality. That weekend, their daughter called. Lena told her what had happened. "You what?" her daughter had said, half laughing, half horrified. "Mom, that's not normal. You have wild bobcats living in your backyard?" Lena smiled at the disbelief in her daughter's voice. "No, honey," she replied gently. "They're just visiting. We're the ones learning how to live here." And in that simple sentence was the quiet revolution that had begun to bloom in their lives. For all the control people tried to exert over nature, with fences and pesticides and neat rows of drought-tolerant plants, the wild was always near, waiting, watching. Sometimes it came as nuisance, sometimes as threat, and sometimes, if you were still enough to notice, it arrived as a gift, a wild, untamed gift, with tufted ears and velvet paws, daring you to rethink the lines you thought were unmovable. Lena and Frank Delaney weren't just homeowners anymore. They were hosts, witnesses, quiet participants in a story that had been written long before they ever set foot in Sagewood Hills. And for the first time in years, life felt wonderfully uncertain. At first, Lena and Frank weren't sure what to do. Their calls to Sagewood Hills Animal Services were met with sympathy but little action. "Unless they're aggressive," a dispatcher named Kara explained, "we don't remove native wildlife." They then contacted Arizona Game and Land, where Wildlife Officer Dean Morales offered more insight. With housing developments expanding, Dean explained, "Bobcats are adapting. That mother probably found your yard during last month's monsoon. It's quiet, dry, and protected, a perfect den site." "But our dogs," Frank interjected. "They're small." "I understand. Keep them inside or supervised." A mother bobcat with kittens can be defensive. For the next week, the Delaneys watched their new neighbors with a mix of awe and unease. Muffin and Scout whined at the sliding door, frustrated at being sidelined. Meanwhile, the kittens, unaware of the drama they'd caused, played, pounced, and prowled in pure feline joy. Then came the first surprise. Lena was gazing out the window when she noticed movement by the garden shed. One kitten, then two, three. "Frank," she called, "we have more." By the time he joined her, 5 bobcat kittens were tumbling across the yard. 5. The mother lounged beneath the mesquite, glancing occasionally at the house, as if proudly presenting her brood. "She's showing them off," Lena whispered, despite herself smiling. It was as if nature had cracked open a secret just for them. The kittens spilled out across the gravel like marbles dropped from an unseen hand, each one distinct in its markings and personality. One pawed curiously at a cactus blossom, oblivious to the spines. Another climbed halfway up a clay pot before toppling backward with theatrical flair. The smallest, later dubbed Pebble, was still wobbly, struggling to keep up with the chaos of her siblings, but her determination was palpable. Frank leaned in closer to the window, watching their movements like he was studying a wild ballet. 5 of them. That's no accident. That's an ecosystem at work. Lena felt the words settle into her, weighty and wondrous. These weren't just animals, they were a living lesson in coexistence. All her years in the classroom flashed through her mind, laminated posters of food webs, children drawing paw prints in crayon, field trips to petting zoos that never quite scratched the surface of real wildness. And now, here it was. Unscripted, uncontainable. Still, wonder came with worry. What if one of them gets hurt? She asked, more to herself than to Frank. Or gets too curious near the patio lights or Scout's water bowl. We keep watching, he replied, his voice even, and we stay out of their way. Easier said than done. Their backyard, once a space of routine leisure, had become a stage, and every movement had consequence. Lena hesitated even to open the sliding door for fear of disrupting some vital interaction. They stopped trimming the mesquite, moved their gardening tools to the front. Even the wind chimes were taken down after one of the kittens seemed startled by their high, tinkling song. Muffin and Scout were perplexed. The rules of the household had changed, and no one had consulted them. The terriers took to pacing the living room, noses pressed to the glass like furry sentries. Occasionally Muffin let out a single yip of protest, quickly shushed by Lena, who feared startling the wild visitors. At night, Frank began keeping a small notebook by his recliner, jotting down any observations. 3 kittens active at dusk. Mother circled perimeter twice. No sign of male bobcat. They became naturalists by necessity, turning casual backyard surveillance into something more reverent. Watching the bobcats became a form of meditation, a return to stillness. A lesson in presence. Do you realize, Lena mused one morning, that we haven't turned on the television in days? Frank smiled without looking up from his binoculars. I'd rather watch this channel. The kittens grew bolder with each passing morning. One began scaling the lattice of Lena's trellis, another pounced with surprising accuracy on a grasshopper. Once, 2 of them batted a fallen pecan back and forth like feline hockey players. The game ended only when their mother stood, gave a low, throaty chirrup, and they all froze in attention before bounding back to her side. She's teaching them, Frank observed. Not just how to hunt, but when to listen, when to obey. Lena nodded. Reminds me of playground duty. You let them run wild until someone's about to eat mulch. They laughed, but the truth in her words struck a chord. There was a rhythm to this wild parenting, a balance of discipline and permission that echoed across species. Some evenings, after the bobcats retreated into the underbrush, Lena would sit outside in the fading heat and journal. She didn't always write about the kittens. Sometimes she wrote about her own children, now grown and scattered, about the ache that surprised her at odd moments, like when she passed a school bus or found an old drawing tucked in the back of a drawer. I wonder if she feels it too, she wrote once. The knowing that one day, they'll all wander off, one by one, and she'll be left in the silence she once thought she longed for. Nature, it seemed, had a way of folding universal truths into its smallest dramas. And yet, the drama was real. One afternoon, a sharp cry split the air, a high-pitched mewl followed by the rustle of gravel. Lena dashed to the window just in time to see one of the kittens limping, its back leg dragging slightly behind. The mother appeared instantly, her entire body transforming from elegance to urgency. She nuzzled the injured kitten, then licked its leg, her tail twitching in rhythmic frustration. Lena's instinct was to run out, to help, to intervene, but she held herself back. She knows what she's doing, Frank said gently. The next day, the kitten was still limping, but it was also playing, hopping, adapting. Resilience, Lena thought, wasn't just about healing. Sometimes it was about redefining motion. The Delaney's backyard had become both sanctuary and classroom. Each day brought a new lesson, in patience, in humility, in the quiet strength of non-interference. They had seen documentaries, read articles, heard lectures, but none of it compared to this raw, unfiltered contact. A friend who stopped by briefly to return a borrowed garden spade took one look at the kittens and gasped. "You need to call someone," she insisted. "They're wild animals. It's dangerous." But Lena only smiled and shook her head. "So are we, sometimes. The trick is knowing when to growl and when to curl up under the mesquite." Later that evening, Frank looked up from his notebook and said, "She really is showing them off, you know. Like a parent at a science fair." Lena laughed softly. "And we're the judges who didn't even know we'd been invited." Their routines changed. Frank began gardening out front. Lena set up her knitting chair by the back window, notebook in hand. She began documenting the kitten's antics. One with a kink in its tail stalked a lizard today. The runt, we call her Pebble, tried to climb the bird bath, failed spectacularly. The yard slowly morphed. Prey animals, mice, voles, even a dismembered jackrabbit, started appearing as half-eaten gifts. The smell wasn't pleasant. "This is out of hand," Frank muttered one morning, plugging his nose. "They're learning," Lena replied, her tone equal parts exasperated and maternal. Sometimes she caught herself defending them the same way she had defended her children when they tracked in mud or left peanut butter fingerprints on the refrigerator door. The mess was proof of growth, a necessary nuisance of the learning process. Still, she found herself lighting candles more often and placing bowls of vinegar around the patio, old tricks from her teaching days to absorb the odor of classroom science projects gone awry. Then came the real shock. Frank ventured into the backyard to check the irrigation system. He moved cautiously, the mother bobcat watching but not reacting. But near the garden shed, a low growl stopped him cold. Less than 10 feet away stood a second adult bobcat, larger, broader, one ear ragged from an old fight. "Lena," Frank called, calm but urgent. "Call Dean, now." His voice was level, but she knew that tone, the same one he'd used years ago when a stranger collapsed near their hiking trail in Prescott and Frank had taken charge while waiting for paramedics. He wasn't panicking, but every cell in his body was alert, calibrated, focused. Through the glass, Lena could see the tension in his shoulders, how he held himself still but not stiff. The second bobcat stood its ground, muscles rippling beneath a coat scarred and sun-bleached. Its gaze was direct, assessing, ancient. For a moment, Lena felt as though time had folded over, and Frank wasn't standing in a backyard in suburban Arizona, but in some ancestral place, a wild, unwalled world where man and beast still negotiated territory face to face. She dialed Dean with shaking fingers, her voice a whisper out of instinct rather than necessity. Outside, Frank took a single step back, then another, until he reached the porch. Only then did the second bobcat lower its head, as if acknowledging a truce had been temporarily granted. Inside, Lena clutched his hand. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Frank said. "Eyes still fixed on the yard. But I don't think he just wandered in." The presence of the second adult shifted everything. The family wasn't just surviving, it was part of a dynamic, evolving structure. And now, the Delaneys were no longer just observers. They were part of the territory too. Wildlife Officer Dean arrived within the hour, binoculars in hand. He watched from the living room, nodding slowly. "That's likely the father," he said. "Unusual to see him in daylight, but plentiful prey can alter behaviors." "Is this safe?" Lena asked. "As long as you respect their space. They don't see you as a threat, that's a good sign. Relocating them, Dean explained, was dangerous. The stress could kill the kittens. Their best option was gentle discouragement. Lights, sprinklers, loud radio voices, strong scents near the fence line. But even as Dean spoke, the couple exchanged a glance. They weren't ready to say goodbye. It wasn't just about attachment, not entirely. Yes, Lena had started referring to the kittens by nickname, and yes, Frank had carved out time each evening to scroll through the latest trail cam footage as if it were the nightly news. But more than that, it was the rare intimacy of being trusted by something wild. The mother bobcat had allowed them this closeness, this shared existence, without fear or challenge. That was no small thing. Outside, the father bobcat paced near the edge of the garden shed, his body low, his movements precise and fluid. He was a contradiction in form, scarred but graceful, deliberate but instinctual, nature distilled into muscle and presence. Even Dean, who had seen hundreds of bobcats in the wild, kept his voice low. "He's not here to cause trouble," Dean murmured. "At least, not to you. He's just here." And just here carried a profound weight. In a world of shrinking habitats and sprawling cul-de-sacs, the idea that a wild animal could still claim part of the land for its own purposes was, in a strange way, reassuring. A reminder that the wilderness hadn't entirely given up on humans. Dean walked the perimeter of the house with Frank, pointing out places where the bobcats might enter or rest. Lena followed a few paces behind, arms folded, absorbing the information but already sensing the truth they both weren't ready to voice. "Motion sensors?" Dean suggested. Frank nodded. "We've got a couple we could rig to the old hose spigot and back gate." Dean gave an approving grunt. Just enough to nudge them along, let them know this space isn't completely theirs. But as they rounded the corner of the house and looked out toward the mesquite tree, they saw two of the kittens curled together in a patch of late morning sun. One yawned, jaw stretching impossibly wide, then nestled its face into its sibling's neck. Frank exhaled through his nose. "They don't look like invaders." Dean chuckled softly. "No, they look like children who haven't yet been told no." Back inside, Lena brewed a fresh pot of coffee, her hands moving on autopilot as Dean laid out additional deterrent strategies: citrus oils, ammonia-soaked rags, the scent of predator urine. "You could even leave a radio tuned to AM talk," Dean added. "They don't like the human voice much." But Lena barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the yard, on the ring of flattened grass that marked the bobcat's favorite resting place. They weren't just borrowing space, they had shaped it. And so had she. And the idea of unraveling it all with artificial smells and radio static felt, in some deep place she didn't yet understand, like a kind of betrayal. So they compromised. They left bird feeders in front, used the patio only midday, and kept Muffin and Scout supervised. The backyard, especially the shaded area near the shed, remained undisturbed. Their observations became more detailed. They learned each kitten's quirks. Shadow, the silent observer. Thistle, all claws and mischief. Branch, always halfway up a tree. Pebble, small but fierce. Pounce, named for obvious reasons. Frank installed a trail cam. The footage at night was mesmerizing. Silent hunts, family meals, midnight games. "You see that crouch?" Frank said one night, tablet in hand. "She's teaching them how to stalk." Lena leaned in closer, squinting at the glowing screen. On the grainy night vision clip, the mother bobcat moved like liquid shadow, her body low, movements elegant and exact. The kittens mirrored her, some more effectively than others. Pebble was slightly off rhythm, a half step behind, but her eyes never left her mother's form. "She's got spirit," Lena murmured. "You can see it in the way she tries again and again." Frank nodded. "That one's going to outlast them all." It became their shared ritual, reviewing footage like other couples reviewed travel brochures or home improvement catalogs. Their evenings were filled with the subtle crunch of gravel under paws, soft rustling in the sagebrush, and the curious high-pitched chirps the kittens used when they couldn't find their siblings. Lena started annotating the footage, building timelines and behavior patterns. Her spiral-bound notebook became a miniature field guide, complete with colored tabs and sketches. It reminded her of her teaching years, the satisfaction of watching children evolve day by day, of decoding their temperaments from playground encounters and art projects. Branch has a favorite route, she noted one evening. Fence line to birdbath to fig pot to mesquite trunk. He does it in the same order every time. And Pounce is practicing the ambush, Frank added. 3 nights in a row, he hid behind the wheelbarrow. They were scientists, in their own small way. Uncertified, but deeply attentive. And wasn't that how all science started? Someone watching the stars long enough to chart their patterns? But it wasn't all idyllic. One morning, Lena discovered what was left of a dove beneath the patio table, a ring of feathers, a blood-dark smear, and nothing more. She stared at it for a long while, the sun climbing behind her. It wasn't cruelty, she knew. It was necessity. The kittens were learning, and learning came with sacrifice. Still, she laid a flat stone over the site, almost ritualistically, a small act of reverence. Death deserved acknowledgement, even when it served life. Sometimes, the reality of their arrangement pressed close. Friends from church expressed polite alarm. A neighbor, catching sight of Branch on a morning stroll, knocked on their door and offered a can of pepper spray. "You never know," he said, but Lena just thanked him and declined. "We do know," she said gently. And they did, more than they'd ever expected. There was something ancient about the rhythm that had emerged between the Delaneys and the Bobcat family. A mutual awareness. A silent agreement. One afternoon, Lena sat on the patio with her knitting, the sun warm against her shoulder, and Shadow emerged from beneath the garden shed. He didn't startle, didn't slink away. Instead, he stood at the edge of the shaded patch and looked at her, blinking slowly, as if taking her measure. He tilted his head. She tilted hers. And then he padded off. Later, Frank found her still sitting there, yarn forgotten in her lap. "He looked right at me," she said. "And it wasn't fear. It was something else." "Recognition," Frank said. "Maybe he knows your name." Lena laughed, but her throat tightened unexpectedly. There was something humbling in the idea, being known by a wild thing. That night, as they watched more footage, Pounce failing an ambush, Pebble climbing onto Branch's back in a mock sneak attack, the mother returning with a freshly caught vole, Lena reached for Frank's hand. "Do you think they'll remember us?" she asked. Frank squeezed her fingers. "I think we're already a part of the story they'll carry with them." One day, a sudden storm rolled through Sagewood Hills. The Delaneys watched from the living room as the mother led her kittens under the shed. But Pebble wasn't with them. Lena spotted her, tiny, soaked, shivering against the back fence. "We have to help," Lena said. "Wait, look." The mother bobcat bounded across the flooded yard to her daughter. But instead of carrying her, she nudged. Coaxed. Pebble tried. Stumbled. The water was too deep. Then the mother looked at the house. Right at Lena and Frank. Frank, moved by something primal and profound, grabbed an umbrella and stepped into the storm. He crossed the yard, laying the umbrella as a bridge over the deepest puddle. Pebble took it, and the mother carried her the rest of the way. Back inside, soaked and breathless, Frank said only, "She trusted me." For a long moment, Lena didn't speak. The storm rattled on above them, drumming its wild rhythm against the roof, but everything inside the house had gone perfectly still. Frank stood just inside the threshold, his shoulders rising and falling with the kind of breath that only comes after something unspoken and irreversible has passed between souls. She reached for a towel and draped it around him, her fingers trembling. Out in the yard, the mother bobcat was already tucking Pebble under her body, licking the kitten's ears with firm, urgent strokes. The makeshift bridge, Frank's old umbrella, sun-bleached and fraying at the tips, lay half-submerged in the flooded grass, like a forgotten offering to something older than weather. She looked at us, Lena said at last. Not past us. Not through us. At us. Frank nodded. It was more than instinct. In that look, brief as it had been, there was a flicker of something ancient, something that surpassed species or language. It was a recognition, a call across the boundaries of wild and domestic, a shared moment of trust born not from domination or fear, but from the simple understanding that one being needed help, and another could offer it. Frank had seen that look only once before, in the high Sierras, decades earlier, when a golden eagle had crash-landed near a trailhead after colliding with a power line. He and a fellow ranger had approached cautiously, hearts thudding like drums, and the injured raptor had turned its bloodied head toward them with the same haunting gaze. It was not a plea. It was permission. This wasn't just about Pebble, Lena whispered. She tested us. Or maybe, included us. The idea sounded ridiculous as it left her lips, but Frank didn't laugh. He understood. Nature rarely announces its invitations with clarity. Instead, it offers subtle keys, small bridges across fear and instinct, like a kitten too wet to climb home, or a mother pausing just long enough to make sure you're watching. That night, the storm passed, but neither of them slept much. They checked the back window often, waiting for signs of movement. Around 3 a.m., Lena caught sight of the mother bobcat emerging from beneath the shed. She stretched, then sat upright, her eyes scanning the yard. For a moment, she faced the house again, just a silhouette against the shimmering moonlit wetness, and Lena felt it once more, that rare privilege of being seen not as a stranger, but as a participant in something elemental. The next morning, the umbrella was still in the yard, collapsed and muddy, its curved handle sticking out from the pooled rain like a question mark. Frank retrieved it carefully, rinsed it under the hose, and leaned it beside the back door. They never used it again. From that moment on, the boundaries blurred. The mother stopped retreating during midday. The kittens occasionally napped in the open. Lena kept journaling. Frank kept filming. Eventually, the kittens began leaving. One by one, they dispersed. The final morning, only Pebble and Shadow remained. The mother sat with them near the mesquite, facing the house. A moment passed. Then they rose and disappeared over the fence. The Delaneys were alone again. Or so they thought. 2 weeks later, a single feather, neatly placed, appeared on their doormat. Then another, and another. Then one evening, as dusk turned the yard lavender, Lena saw her, Pebble, sitting at the fence. Healthy, grown, wild and free. She made it, Lena whispered. She came again. So did Shadow. Never too close. Just enough. The visits were fleeting, like dreams remembered only in pieces, more sensed than seen. Sometimes there was only a glimpse, a tawny blur moving through the shadows near the fence, or a pair of golden eyes catching the last rays of evening sun before vanishing behind the hedge. But it was always enough. Enough to stir something deep and ancient inside them. Enough to remind them that they had been part of something rare and unrehearsed. Sometimes the gifts returned, another feather, a bit of dried bark placed precisely on the mat, as if arranged with purpose. Once, Lena found a small pebble near the birdbath. It was smooth, pale gray, and shaped like a teardrop. She held it in her palm for a long time before setting it on the kitchen windowsill. She never told Frank. Some mornings, the dew held tracks, barely visible impressions in the soil that glimmered in the light for just a few minutes before fading. Like memories do, Frank took to waking earlier, stepping onto the back patio barefoot with a mug of black coffee in hand, scanning the yard like a man reading scripture. These aren't just visits, he said once. They're reminders. Reminders of what? Lena asked. He took a sip, ice still on the garden. That it was real. That it happened. That we were trusted. Trust, Lena thought, wasn't something you could demand from a wild thing. It was something offered. Slowly. Carefully. And sometimes only once. Their backyard had changed since the Bobcats left, not in layout, but in spirit. They'd planted new succulents and added a low bench under the mesquite, but it all felt sacred now, like they were curators of a space that had been hallowed by something greater than themselves. Even Muffin and Scout tread differently now. They sniffed around the old den site but never barked. As if they, too, remembered. Frank eventually packed away the trail cam, storing the footage on a hard drive labeled Neighbors, Spring to Fall. But Lena kept journaling. The pages became more reflective, part memoir, part field notes. She began sketching more. Not just the bobcats, but also the birds, the clouds, the shifting color of the gravel when the sun hit it just right. In the margins, she wrote small questions. Did she choose us because we were quiet? Was Pebble the only one who would have taken the umbrella bridge? How do you thank a creature who doesn't need thanks? Life resumed. The kids visited. Friends stopped by. The seasons turned with their usual indifference. But beneath it all, Lena and Frank carried a new awareness, an invisible thread that tied them to the wilder rhythm of things. One afternoon in early winter, while clearing fallen leaves from beneath the mesquite, Frank found a small indentation in the earth, not fresh, but unmistakable, the shape of a body curled tightly in sleep. He didn't call Lena. He just knelt there for a moment, placed his hand over the print, and whispered something the wind carried off before anyone else could hear. That night, they sat on the patio together, wrapped in blankets, the dogs curled beside them. Stars blinked overhead, sharp and clear. You think they'll ever come back? Lena asked. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, squinting into the dark. A shadow moved at the edge of the yard, then paused. Lena caught her breath. It was Pebble. She stood tall now, lean, sleek, her ears perked and sharp. A scar ran along her front leg, a souvenir from some lesson learned far from the safety of the Delaney's yard. But she looked strong, capable. For a moment, she met their gaze. Then, slowly, she blinked, and was gone. Lena smiled. She remembers, she said softly. She'll always remember. If this story touched your heart, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves wildlife, or someone who might need a gentle reminder of the quiet wonder happening just beyond the backyard fence. What would you do if a wild bobcat family made your yard their home? Would you welcome them, observe from a distance, or feel torn between caution and curiosity? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss another true animal encounter that blurs the line between wild and home.